Thank you everyone again for joining us, part of our AKAM monthly webinar series. Today's topic is SIRS compliance deadline. What is required by 12/31/2024? As I previously mentioned, our featured speakers today are Will Simmons. Will is the president of Association Reserves for Florida, has extensive experience with reserve studies, working with board of directors and the proper planning for long-term planning and capital projects and replacement for long-term replacement of objects. And Doug Weinstein will also be joining us as a panelist. He's a senior vice president of operations with us at AKAM Southeast. My name is David Ward. I'm the director of business development here at AKAM with a special focus on Miami-Dade. So with that, Doug, you want to go over a little bit of what we'll be talking about today?
Sure, David. Thank you, and welcome to all our participants in this very up-to-date and important subject. Just a couple of business items before we get started. If you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A, and we will try and get to all of them during the later part of the session today. Also, the information today will be general information. We don't have everybody's SIRS report, or we don't have everybody's documents, so we cannot answer an association particular question. So what we normally do is just recommend to your board and your board members, if you have a question concerning the SIRS as it relates directly to either your association documents or anything else directly related to your association, please consult with your association attorney and or auditor and or obviously your SIRS specialist who did your report. So today's information will be generic and we will not be able to answer any particular association comments. That being said, what we're going to be doing today is getting more into the weeds of what does a board need to do? What are their options going forward with complying with the deadline? Obviously, the deadline to procure your SIRS is 12/31/24. And that means to basically have the report done by that date. We all know, unfortunately, there are a lot more condominium associations in Florida than there are reserve specialists. So one of the things that we've been asked, and Will has too, is, well, what happens if we don't have it done by then? Well, there's two things to that question, and I'll let Will opine in a moment from what he's heard from the state, is the likelihood that there are certain associations who have looked to get their SIRS done, and because of the vast amount of SIRS that need to be done, will not have the report ready by the December 31st, 24. So what happens if you don't? And it basically falls into a couple of areas. The law states that you need to have it done by then. However, if a building or an association has a signed agreement with a reserve specialist, from what we're hearing, and I'll let Will comment in a second, that the DBPR will look at that and say that association's board has made an attempt to comply with the deadline, but because of the amount of associations out there, they may not be able to get it done by the date, but they have entered into an agreement with a reserve specialist or an engineer to do that. And the other is, unfortunately, the people that don't have it done don't have an agreement. And there's language in the law that states that a board can be held responsible if they willfully do not attempt to get the SIRS report done. Will, what are you hearing out there with the state and with compliance and the deadlines?
Yeah, well, first of all, David and Doug, thanks for having me back. Always good to chat with you guys. And hopefully this will be a good session to inform as many people as we can about kind of the latest status of things. But yeah, on that point about, what happens if you don't have this done? I think that everybody, certainly in our industry, and most of the people who are at least familiar with this new requirement, understand that this is a pretty big math problem. There are many, many more associations than not, that are probably not going to have this done by the end of this year. And so if we look at what the legislation says, the teeth of this legislation with regard to this deadline says that if a board of directors willfully and knowingly fails to have the SIRS completed by the end of December 31st, 2024, then effectively they are in breach of their fiduciary duty. Now, I think a lot hinges on the words willfully and knowingly there, and particularly willfully, right? So I don't think any board could be held to some sort of punishment or penalty for seeking out proposals and trying to contact as many companies as they can and being told that we just can't do it. We are at capacity. We've already committed to so many other buildings that, yes, we would love to work with you and we will get to you, but unfortunately it's not going to be by the end of 2024. So, we've been hearing that kind of in conversation with legislators, with attorneys. Our company spoke to the head of a major insurance provider for directors and officers coverage, and pretty much everybody's in agreement that, look, it was the state's best intention to have, everybody or as many buildings as they could get this done by the end of the year. But we all kind of know that's impossible. So what I would tell boards out there is do your best. Like you said, Doug, make the effort, make the attempt, get the proposals, maybe get on somebody's schedule. And I think that's going to have to be good enough. I just don't see how you can penalize associations for something that's outside of their control at this point.
Right, absolutely. Now, also, one of the things that we do also want to clarify, because there's been a bunch of going back and forth, and in the beginning, some people were, looking at the law and saying, oh, it's a gray area, is terms of when you have to comply, your budget needs to comply with the SIRS requirements. So let's talk about that for a moment, and then we'll start getting into the actual reporting and the actual reports. So basically what the law says is that if you pass, and again, it's pass and approve your budget prior to December 31st, 2024, and this is for your 25 budget, the year 2025 operating budget, that you can put off the SIRS components or the SIRS inclusion to the 2026 budget. But it's very important to note that, again, you need to have your budget approved, your 2025 budget approved by no later than December 31st of 24. So those associations that in the past had gone into January or February before approving their next year's budget now have an impetus to obviously get that approved before the end of the year. Because if you're going to wait till January or February to approve that budget, you're going to have to include the SIRS funding in that budget for 2025. And Will, any further information on that?
No, the only thing I would edit about what you just said is where you said that the association can put it off. I would say, to be more specific, what has to happen is the membership would have to vote to formally waive or partially fund reserves. So you could say that this budget season that we are now entering into, for associations that operate on a January to December fiscal year, usually late summer and fall is when you're adopting your budget. This is the last cycle where the members will have that option, at least with respect to the structural integrity components, the roof, the painting, the windows and doors, all of those things. Beginning with next year's budget cycle, right? So 2025, looking ahead to 26, you will not have that voting option anymore. It will be mandatory to include funding for these SIRS components. And so, again, in effect, this year, it would still be mandatory, except if it's voted against.
Right.
Gentlemen,
Again,
we just now had a question come in, and I think it's worth just to triple clarify. So if the budget is approved by 12/31 of 2024, will we not have to include SIRS funding for 2025 budget? The answer to that is you would have the option before 12/31 of 2024 to either partially or fully waive the structural integrity reserves section of your reserves. You don't
With a
have that
membership
option
vote.
next year. So
With a membership vote, as we'll just portray.
Yeah, I actually have the actual text of the bill pulled up on my screen. If we just want to go right to the chapter and verse for people, I can share that. We can do that later or whenever you feel is
No,
good.
let's do it now. Let's do it, and then we'll move on to the actual report.
Okay. All right. Let me just do that. And you'll see here on the screen in a moment, this is, you guys can see that now, I hope. Let me try to make it larger. So the exact wording that we're referring to, again, this is Senate Bill 154, for a budget adopted on or after December 31st, 2024, the members of a unit owner controlled association that must obtain a structural integrity reserve study, okay, so that's going to be residential condos that are 3 stories or above, may not determine to provide no reserves or less reserves than required by this subsection for items listed in paragraph G. And paragraph G is the summary of the specific components that need to be included. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, this is the law of the land. This is where we get that from. It's a little bit more of a wordy way of stating it, but yeah, the members may not determine to provide no reserves or less reserves. But the key timeline here is for a budget adopted on or after December 31st, 2024.
Right. And also, most of the attorneys association attorneys that we talk to are also stressing to do that membership vote to waive it so that you have that on record, as Will said before.
Right.
So let's move on now to the meat of the webinar, which is going to be going through your actual SIRS report. What sort of options does an association board have in crafting their funding? Is to, again, a lot of questions have come up, pooled versus the other methods, how to fund, when to fund, things like that. So Will, why don't we start walking through a typical study, and then we'll start interjecting questions as they come up.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to, again, share screen. I'll pull up, this is an example of a SIRS, structural integrity reserve study that our company would have produced. And I'm not going to do obviously a complete overhaul on this. This is a 62-page document, but what I wanted to show people is just some of the nuts and bolts, right? If you've never seen a reserve study or if you've never seen a SIRS before, it's going to look something like this. Okay. So, again, this is looking ahead. In this case, the fiscal year we're talking about in this, sample association is January to December 2025. And one of the things you're always going to get in a reserve study is something that looks like this. This is the component list. Okay, and so this is identifying all of the things that meet these criteria. So the green sort of headers here are showing the specific named items that are in the legislation. So we've got roof, structure, fireproofing and fire protection, plumbing, electrical, exterior painting and waterproofing, windows and exterior doors, and then other components. Now, the other components here refers to components that are more than $10,000, which, if they were neglected, could somehow compromise or affect something else on this list. So that's not a clearly defined thing in the statute. That's up to the provider of the study to figure out, okay, what costs a lot of money here that if you neglected it might compromise something else. And usually that's going to
What kind of components are you seeing that fall into that category, Will?
Yeah, well, we've got a couple examples here. Deck railings, are going to be a big one. Balcony railings or catwalk railings, where you have the posts of these railings embedded into a concrete slab, right? So they're attached to the structure of the building. And what happens with these railings over, a couple of decades, especially in a coastal area, is that those post pockets can become waterlogged and basically lead to concrete restoration issues. Sometimes it has to do with the difference in metals between the bolts holding those into the slab. Those might be steel and the aluminum post itself, the interaction between those metals actually can create a little, almost like an electrical current. And it can lead to corrosion of the slab. So we would say that by that definition, if you neglect to maintain or repair or replace these railings, it could actually compromise the concrete structure of the building. Some other examples there might be, anything attached to the building envelope. In this example here, we put down a ladder that just happens to be bolted to the side of the rooftop in this property, I believe. It could also be things like pool decks, planter boxes, anything that if it were to leak, if the water would migrate into the structure of the building, that could cause a problem. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit open-ended. We're not finding tons and tons of things that meet these definitions. Most everything else on the list, I think, is more self-explanatory. Roof can be different roofing types, whatever roofing types you have. In this case, this building has flat roofs in the middle with kind of tile and metal accents around it. Our interpretation of structure in this case usually is just going to be an allowance for concrete restoration. In most buildings, the structure itself, right, the foundation, the load-bearing walls, everything that's holding the building up should last indefinitely, right? This is one of the things that we talked about a lot when Senate Bill 4D first came along, is that they named foundation specifically as a component, and everybody said, how could you possibly replace the foundation? It's supposed to be there forever, which I would agree with. So usually in a SIRS, we're just including allowances for concrete repairs, repairs to the structure, but not wholesale replacement. Fireproofing and fire protection, this is going to be fire alarm and sprinkler components. Plumbing and electrical, kind of a little bit open-ended. For most buildings, especially newer buildings, it's going to be very difficult to pin down specific plumbing or electrical problems. As buildings age, those may manifest and now become something you need to worry about. But that's one of the nice things in the SIRS legislation, is that if the remaining life of something exceeds 25 years, or if it does not have a determinable remaining life, then the provider of the study can actually elect not to recommend funding for it. Exterior painting and waterproofing, pretty straightforward. Windows and doors, I would just qualify that to say it's only the ones that the association is responsible to maintain. So if your condo declaration shows that the unit owner takes care of their own windows and doors and is responsible to replace them, no need to fund reserves for that. So this is kind of like the fundamental building blocks of the study. These are the things that we care about that are named in the statute. We've got the useful life and remaining useful life estimates for those. You're going to have a cost estimate assigned to each one, and those are going to determine the timelines for these future expenses. Okay, so it's not just about what is immediately necessary to do. In fact, in this building, in this example, there is nothing here that has 0 remaining life left. It is just, these are the things that they have. And in most cases, they have, some amount of life remaining. What we care about is funding towards their eventual replacement. And that's what I wanted to kind of highlight next. I'm going to kind of just go through and highlight a couple of tables that I think really articulate the funding requirements here, which is, I think, what most people are going to care about. So,
Will, we had a question. We had a question in the Q&A just to dovetail back for a moment to the particular elements that are included in the SIRS.
Yeah.
And we had a question, was what falls under amenity deck for waterproofing? And I think the answer to that would be, it would depend on, is your amenity deck over a structure or part of a structure? Whereas amenity deck that would be on grade, let's say, would not necessarily affect a structure, therefore would not have to be included.
Exactly right. Yep. So imagine let's say a high-rise building that has a parking structure, maybe 3-4 level parking structure, and then the pool deck exists on top of the parking structure, right? That is effectively the roof of the parking structure. And so whatever you've got there, tile, pavers, planter boxes, anything that's there to keep water out of the building, if those fail and those waterproofing elements do not last forever, that would allow water to migrate through the slab or through the top of the structure and cause a bunch of structural issues. So very, very different than if you've got a pool deck that's at ground level, that's just, if water gets through it, it goes into the earth and nobody cares. But if the consequence of water penetrating that structure or through that amenity deck could lead to other issues, that's when it now becomes something you would need to include in your SIRS.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So, again, this is kind of a high level overview, but this is what I'm going to try to show people is how these things get funded and what you're obligated to do. So, a moment ago, I talked about the fact that each component has a remaining useful life and a cost estimate assigned to it. So what we do in our study is we're going to look ahead and see, okay, in which years are these things taking place and what kind of costs can this building expect at that point in time? And we can develop a projection. In this case, we're looking at 30 years, right? So it's starting at 2025, running out to 2054. And we've totaled up the projected levels of spending that is forecast for this building in each of those years. Okay, so that's kind of the need. Those are the obligations they'll be facing. The exercise we then do in the financial analysis part of the study is we look at how much cash do they have on hand for these things, right? What are they starting from? And how much do they need to be adding to that fund each year so that they can pay for these things when they fail, right? So we do a starting point here. We've got like a starting reserve balance, 2.5 million. The fully funded balance that you see here is a theoretical number that tells us ideally how much money they should have. Okay, and we can come back to that point in a moment. But what they really have is 2.5 million. What they're expected to spend, at least in this case, is nothing in the first year, but then over years 2 and 3, a little over $1 million or so. So the idea is that as cash goes in here, okay, and we can even factor in interest income, as cash goes in and then cash goes out year over year, that process needs to allow for at least some money to be left over in every fiscal year. Okay, so the absolute minimum amount of funding you have to put away into a pooled reserve account is enough that you can pay for all your expenses and never completely run out of money. This is called baseline funding. Okay, so if you look at this study, there's a very low point where this community gets down to a point where they have $2,500 in reserves. Now, remind you, they started with 2.5 million. They get up over the years to having millions and millions of dollars. But as long as they never drop below zero, then this sort of funding plan works, right? It enables them to pay for these expenses without the need for any loans or special assessments. And that's what the state cares about, right? They want buildings to be self-sufficient, to be able to show that they have the cash flow required to pay for their expenses without some group of owners having to cough it up in the form of a special assessment in the future. That's the whole point. So this is the minimum that's required, right? It's called baseline funding. Now I'm going to jump back to the kind of earlier part of the analysis here. And we try to articulate that as clearly as we can. So to this client, looking ahead to 2025, and with the benefit of that foresight that we showed on the other table, we're going to tell them that, look, beginning in 2025, at minimum, your reserves need to be $522,000. Now that will increase over time with inflation, but going into 2025, that's the budget that you're passing now. That's the starting point that you need to achieve is 522,000 in reserves, because we know that anything less than that would send them below zero, right? That low point of what we had, $2,500. If they propose a number that's less than this, it's not going to be sufficient. So this, in this case, would be what is required for this building to do in that year 2025. So, I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, but I'm trying to weave together the threads of the most important parts of the study, right? You've got your component list that drives the need for future cash. You have your starting cash position, which is what we can determine with the client, right? What do you actually have? But then we need to go through that exercise of showing the money going in and the money going out, and where does that leave the association in each fiscal year? So,
and again, just to be reminded that we're talking now about the SIRS components. There's a whole nother reserves part that we're not discussing that associations also need to take into account, which is the non-SIRS reserve components.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and some of those can be arguably more important even in the short term than the SIRS components, right? So let's just imagine a building out there that has a relatively new roof. They just did a painting project. They have no concerns with plumbing, electrical, or fire protection. The windows and doors are all going to last a long time, but they have a cooling tower that's failing, or their elevators need to be modernized. Okay, those are critical elements to living in those buildings. You cannot live in a high-rise building in South Florida without an elevator and without air conditioning. I think we would all agree to that. So despite those not being listed as SIRS components, they are absolutely still very important for that building to maintain and to be funding for. So, you know, under statute 718, we know that the original definition of a reserve component still applies. It's roofing, painting, pavement, regardless of cost, and then anything over $10,000. So when we're working with these buildings now, we're actually preparing two documents for them. One is their SIRS report, and the other is their non-SIRS or their other reserves. And I would say most of the time, the other reserve category is actually larger. There's more things there that they need to be paying attention to. And some of those are still very critical. So just by virtue of something being listed as a SIRS component may not tell the whole story. Your building still needs to look at the totality of all of your components and make sure you have a good plan in place for all of them.
Well, we have a great question here, just saying, how do we actually allocate funding between the SIRS components and the non-SIRS components for reserves? And I think it's related to what you just said. Your company would have two separate reports.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of carefully following those two separate reports where I believe management teams or boards are recommending separate actual accounts as well, like actual bank accounts.
Yeah, well, yeah, we would agree with that approach. You really want to kind of, you know, separate those two. The problem is, up until these new requirements, you could have a building that just had one pooled reserve account that it used for all of its components, whether those are now considered SIRS or not. And so what we've been advising our clients to do is to kind of take that pool and break it into two pools of funds, one for the structural elements, one for everything else. Now, how do you figure out how much money goes into each one? I think that's maybe what's being asked. And it's not an obvious answer. It can be different for each association. What we do is we look at the underlying need for reserves, which was something we call the fully funded balance. And we do actually have a table, which I'll show to try to make this easier. You know, in a situation like this, where we've already split the components into those two categories, we then look at this figure that we call the fully funded balance. And this tells us, in theory, how much money the association should have in each of these pools. Okay, so my fully funded balance for my SIRS components is going to be the sum of several calculations, right? And ultimately what I'm doing in each one of these is I'm looking at the cost of a component, right? In this case, the cost of replacing the single ply roof, $850,000. But that roof is not at the end of its life. Let's say it's 7 years old out of a 20-year useful life. Okay, so it's 7/20ths of the way through. We would take the 850,000, multiply that by 7/20, and that tells us that the fully funded balance for this roof right now is $297,500. That's how much money this association should have in reserves for the roof now. Okay, now I can do all that math for all of these components and add them together and get a lump sum, right? So based on these components, their costs, and where they are at in their lifespan, I come up with a theoretical number to tell me, okay, ideally, this is what you should have. I can do the same exact process for my non-SIRS components, right? For my gym equipment, my parking lot, my swimming pool. How old is everything? What does it cost? And what proportion of that cost would I ideally want to have now? Okay. So we come up with two kind of ideal numbers, and then we look at the actual cash on hand. So let's say that this, you know, in this example, the client has $2.5 million in their single pooled reserve fund. Now, let's say we calculated that they should have $1 million for their SIRS components. That's the fully funded balance for SIRS. I might tell them, okay, take $1 million out of that 2.5, park it in your SIRS reserves. Let's fully fund those first, right? Let's make sure all the money is there for those. And then if there's money left over, we can use that for the non-SIRS components and then develop a recommendation based on each starting point. Where that might vary is if they have a greater need for immediate money on the non-SIRS side. So like in my example where I said everything else is new and good except the elevators, that's the biggest demand for money in the near future. In that case, I might say, no, actually put more money on the non-SIRS side. The overall goal of this exercise being to try to reduce the burden on the owners, right? What is the balancing act between those two accounts that we can achieve that will produce the lowest possible recommendation for this client? So, the only thing that's different between those two is that they have a little bit of control over the non-SIRS recommendation. That's the one they can still vote against. So, if it's a situation where all else is equal, I would say putting more money towards the SIRS components usually makes more sense because that's the one they have no control over. That's the one that they absolutely have to fund. So if you're going to put more of your capital in that direction, that might be the right move because you can always vote against funding the other side.
I think one of the things that you mentioned, and again, going back and forth and, breaking apart, and now you have two buckets where, last year you only had one. And one of the questions that we get all the time is if an association or a board in their planning wants to move monies from their existing reserve, their non-SIRS or their old reserve, as we can also phrase it, into the SIRS bucket now, is there any sort of membership vote that's needed to do that, or is that purely at the discretion of the board?
My understanding of that is that anytime reserves are going to be used for a non-scheduled purpose, the members have to vote and approve that. So I don't think the board can just arbitrarily do that. I guess my larger answer is talk to your association's attorney and your accountant. They will be more intimately, aware of your situation and probably be able to give you good guidance. There could be in somebody's, governing documents for the condo that might have an impact there. Generally speaking, right, if you're moving money from the non-SIRS to the SIRS side, I would say that's probably less restricted. What we now know you cannot do is take money from your SIRS components, from your structural components, and use those for something else, right? So one of the legislators that actually helped draft this new law basically explained it saying, we don't want buildings using reserve money that was meant for something critical, like a roof or the structure, and using that money to remodel the lobby or buy new pool furniture, okay? So that, just if you understand the legislative intent behind these restrictions, that will help quite a bit, right? They don't want buildings using money that was for something very important, very critical to the safety of the building, and using that for some other project. So, and we can all understand why that is. The whole reason we're having this discussion is because of Champlain Tower South and the collapse there. So if you view it through that lens, that might make it more clear.
Great. And then one of the other questions that we had gotten during a prior portion of your description here, was do you recommend baseline funding?
We would recommend a target that is a little higher than that. So let me go back to our executive summary here. So when you're talking about funding reserves, there's kind of different schools of thought about what the goal should be. Okay, so the absolute minimum requirement is baseline funding. That means you've got enough cash going in so that as cash goes out, you never go below zero, right? Think of it like a bathtub, okay? If I have a bathtub here and I have my faucet, which is my cash coming in, and I have my drain, which is my cash going out. As long as the cash going in is greater than the cash going out, such that I have some water left in the tub, I'm never going completely bone dry, right? That's what baseline funding is. What we recommend to our clients is something called fully funding, which means you're targeting a higher goal. It's something where we're looking at percent funded as a metric, kind of a barometer of the health of the reserve fund. And we're trying to get them to get to the center of the bullseye, get to 100% funded. that is where your cash on hand is exactly equal to the value of deterioration of your components. The advantage of that is that it's better protecting you against surprises, right? If in a baseline funding scenario, if anything goes wrong, right? If one project comes in earlier than you thought it would, or if it costs more than you thought it would, you've got no margin for error anymore, and you will definitely run out of money. You will definitely need a special assessment, and then you're climbing back up from that position, which nobody wants to do if you can avoid it. So what we recommend is something beyond baseline funding. That's why you see it here. We label it as the optional alternative. It's the recommended amount to achieve 100% funded by the end of this plan, right? So it might look something more like this. Same exact expenses as I showed before, same starting cash position. But now, instead of allowing this reserve balance to get down to zero or close to zero, the idea is that you'll always have a very healthy amount of money in reserves, which is actually equal to the value of deterioration of your assets. And that will almost completely eliminate the risks of special assessments.
Which also, we have another question in the chat, or the Q&A rather, on what are the options for a board to raise these monies now required by the SIRS funding requirements. So, I mean, there's a bunch, you know, a lot of buildings will do it as part of their maintenance requirements or their maintenance budget, their operating budget as the required reserve contribution. What other ways, Will, have you seen clients of yours talk about other ways of funding what now is required?
Well, what you just described is certainly the best way, right? You know, that might mean that the dues have to increase, that you have to commit to a higher level of funding going forward. But there could be some other options or maybe combinations of ideas there that you could use. You know, a special assessment could be one way to do it, right? If you've got, especially in a building where there's very little money set aside and the need to raise a lot of money right away, special assessment might be the only choice, right? Have everybody write a big check right now and be able to enjoy maybe a lower annual budget going forward. And in some senses, that's maybe a more equitable way to do it too. It may be that the same owners who live there now have enjoyed these budgets over the years that didn't have any reserve money at all. And you can think of a special assessment as like a catch-up contribution. Hey, everybody, for the last 10 years, 20 years, whatever, we should have been charging you more in reserve money. We didn't do it. We all voted against it. Now we're going to have a special assessment to make up for that. That's not always necessary, but that could be a way if a building is concerned about the optics of their budget number getting much higher, right? You could just do a special assessment one time, get that injection of cash in the bank, and then maybe your ongoing cash, deposits to reserves, maybe it can be less. You might be able to achieve that with some kind of loan or line of credit as well. You know, if a building goes out and borrows money to take care of a bunch of short-term projects, and then they commit to paying back that loan through the operating budget, maybe that reduces their need for more reserve funding. But, I would say the best choice would just be to understand that reserve money is necessary. It's always been necessary, right? One of the points we've been trying to make to our clients through all this process is that the cost of living in a condo really shouldn't change very much as a result of this. It's just bringing things to light, right? The same ownership in these buildings that would otherwise be paying for things through special assessments or loans is now basically being told by the state, we're going to make you pay for it as you go along through reserve funds. Right? But there is no other option on the table, right? Roofs need replacement. Elevators need modernization. Buildings need to be painted. I think what all this legislation is doing is just taking a couple of options off the table that were always there for buildings that, maybe quite frankly, people were abusing and driving themselves into these kind of financial holes. So I think the goal of the legislation is to try to close that loophole and really make buildings pay more serious attention to this on an annual basis.
Well, I think it's twofold too. It's exactly what you said, and I think it also is going to make buildings maintain their buildings more and to actually do the work when it needs to be done, because those buildings that have done that over the years tend to have a better, if I can use the word better, but a less traumatic SIRS requirement, because they have maintained those structural components over the years. You brought up a good point in terms of those buildings that are going to make this as part of their operating budget as the reserve contribution. Before, we spoke about the requirements or the allowable that boards have to put this, move it to start in a 2026 budget instead of 2025. Again, reminding you that you have to approve your budget on or before, as it said in the actual law. But one of the things that we're recommending to our clients, and I know Will has done a lot of them for our clients, is also recommending, is don't go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in one step. So in other words, if you have to increase your reserve funding, to meet the SIRS requirements, even though you'll be able to move that to the 26 budget, don't go and not do anything in 25. What we're recommending to our clients is take a look at your SIRS, take a look at what your requirement is going to be if you are indeed going to do it in the 26, and phase it in, including some additional reserve funding for that 25 budget year.
Yeah, I would agree. The earlier you start, the better. I think at the very least, if I was a board member, I would be communicating as clearly and loudly as I could to my membership to say, look, everybody, next year, this is mandatory. This year, we're going to start on it just to get you a little bit more acclimated to the fact that our dues are going up. And by the way, this is happening for almost every building in the state. Nobody's being singled out here. It'll be more painful maybe for some buildings that historically have not had any reserves. They're going to have to take a bigger leap here. But if you can start it out this year and then, really embrace it next year and beyond, every little bit will help. It's like planning for retirement or saving for a college fund or anything like that. The earlier you start, the better off you'll be.
Right. We have a question. Can I use baseline funding for the SIRS reserve and keep the excess cash in the non-SIRS reserve?
Yeah, in theory, although those will be two different calculations, right? So there's going to be a baseline number for SIRS and then also a separate baseline number for your other components. So if you wanted to just look at the full funding recommendation that's calculated for SIRS and say, okay, we're going to do baseline here and take the extra and apply it towards our other, you could do that, but it would be better to know what the underlying number is for each one. Because that excess, right, the difference between the full and the baseline number for the SIRS may still not be enough to cover, even on a baseline basis, for the non-SIRS things, depending on what else you have there.
Absolutely. Now, we also have a question here. Again, this is a little, the question was, our building got its CO in 2023. When does the SIRS apply to us?
Now, yeah, the only time difference that matters with CO dates has to deal with milestone inspections.
Right.
So if your building is less than 30 years old as of now, you don't need to do your milestone inspection yet.
Right. But the
SIRS
SIRS is still required.
Yeah,
correct.
Even for new buildings. In fact, even for, I believe it's required for new buildings upon turnover from the developer.
Yes. Yes, that is part of 154 for developer turnover. And again, you brought up a very good point, and let's talk about that for a moment. With, those buildings that are required to do their milestone. And again, as Will just said, it's, that is time dependent in terms of CO, but the SIRS is not. We just want to make sure that everybody understands that. Even if your building is only 5 years old, yes, you don't have to do a milestone this year, but you do have to do a SIRS. So we just want to make that clear. let's talk milestone as it regards SIRS. Obviously, you as a reserve specialist are those buildings that you come on to do their SIRS report are going to look at that milestone, obviously.
Mhm.
How does that dovetail into your figuring?
Yeah, well, a lot of buildings are doing them together. There are some providers out there who are doing both that offer both a milestone and a SIRS. And so in those cases, you know, you've got the same personnel creating two reports for the building. If you've had them done separately, right? Let's say you did a milestone, or even if you did a 40-year certification, the scope of work of what is included there is more limited than what's in a SIRS, right? So a milestone inspection literally just evaluates the structure. It says nothing about plumbing or electrical or fire protection or maybe even other things on the SIRS list. But if your milestone has some good observations and recommendations from an architect or an engineer about the structure itself, then I would say absolutely, whoever is doing the SIRS should use that, right? Especially if it was done by a qualified person, especially so if it was not just a phase 1, but a phase 2 milestone inspection, which goes beyond just a visual. That's very, very helpful information. So if a client comes to us and says, we just had our milestone done, here's a copy of it, we're absolutely going to read through that and see what their recommendations were and try to try to integrate those into what we're recommending, along with everything else that we're looking at. And I would say that's true not just for milestone inspections, but other types of services as well. If you've got a roofing consultant that you've worked with, if you have a plumbing vendor who wrote up a report about the condition of the pipes in the building, you've got a fire alarm vendor who's got, an analysis or an inspection report they put together. All of that is great. You should provide that to your reserve study company so that they can get the impressions and the observations of as many professionals as possible. We know what we're doing as well. We know enough to do our jobs, but we're not experts in any one of these particular fields. So if you do have other expert guidance you can make available, that's always a good thing.
Right. I think you bring up an extremely important point to that is record keeping and giving both your milestone performer and your also reserve study is that the more information you as an association can give your reserve specialist, the more accurate the report is going to be. Instead of just having to depend on, say, useful life charts. If you can show that you overhauled your fire pump or your domestic water pumps, or you did a complete replacement of the fill of other type, like a cooling tower, even for your other reserves, non-SIRS, anything you can garner to provide to your reserve specialists that will get them to give a better useful life, therefore a better financial picture of that component is certainly a very good point.
Yeah.
One of the other questions we had is actually from one of your clients, Will. And it says, happy to say we were guided by Will to conduct our SIRS in 23 for 24. Do we need to update this for the 25 budget?
No, you don't have to. No, so the requirement in the law says that your proposed funding of reserves must be based on your most recent structural integrity reserve study. So if you had one done last year, there's no reason you have to go out and do that again. I guess I will say that in general, reserve studies are perishable. They are not once in a lifetime things. You need to do them at least every couple of years. Obviously, we all know that reserve planning and budgeting is done on an annual basis. So there are, quite a few buildings out there that want to do some type of formal update every year. That's optional, but there's no requirement to do another one for 2025 if you've had one done more recently. What you should do is maybe look at the data there, account for the year that's gone by, right? Account for the fact that if it was done for 24 and now you're looking at 25, the remaining life expectancies are going to shrink by a year. Costs might have gone up a little bit. You should also account for any projects you've done in that time, and then come up with a new recommendation. But you don't need to go through the whole process of doing another study. It just says that, let me see if I can find the bill text again on that. see, it's,
Will, while you're looking for that, I have a
Yeah.
feeling Doug will be able to answer two questions in one here. We only have a couple minutes left, so thank you everyone for joining today. And at the very end, I'm going to be sharing the three of us contact information by email. So just because we only have a few more minutes, we would love to answer everyone's question. But if we didn't answer your question today, definitely email us individually, especially to Will as our expert today. We do have a quick question. What would fall into the non-SIRS reserves? We did touch up a little bit on that earlier. The largest items would be your cooling towers or chillers for your air conditioning system, your
Elevators,
elevators
things
are the
such as
larger
that.
items.
Now, we have a very good question, and this is bringing in another requirement of the state is, and Will, maybe you can address this a little bit, and I think it also, it really depends on a particular building's requirements to conform with their ELSS work as to, would you consider ELSS part of SIRS or non-SIRS? And I think it basically depends on what type of work the ELSS is required for that particular association.
Yeah, I would say it definitely, in almost all cases would fall under fireproofing and fire protection. So by that definition, I would say, yeah, ELSS upgrades or renovations to me would be a SIRS component. Just to add on some of the other things, you guys mentioned a couple big ones: elevators, HVAC systems. Other non-SIRS things can be parking areas, they can be amenities, interior common space, hallway carpeting and painting, other mechanical systems, security cameras, domestic water pumps, access control, tennis courts, anything else that's common area that costs more than $10,000 is really kind of, it's a very broad, open-ended definition, but that's what we start with is anything that doesn't meet the SIRS criteria, but is still more than $10,000 and has a limited and predictable lifespan. Those are the things we would look at for the non-SIRS.
And then we'll follow up with one last question, which is a question that I've been asked a lot, and I'm sure you have too, is can you pool reserves in the SIRS reserve?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, there's no question about it. The pooled method is still valid and viable. The Florida DBPR has gone so far to post that on their own website for people who are asking. Just by virtue of them issuing this list of components now does not mean that those need to be handled in a straight line format where you would have a roof reserve account, a painting reserve account, a fire protection account. You can still have one pooled reserve account that is collectively available for everything on that list. You do not need to adopt a straight line format.
And I think one of the things too is I think it's one of the recommendations that we've heard a lot of auditors, reserve specialists is that you don't use straight line.
Yeah, straight line went out of fashion decades ago. There are still quite a few buildings in Florida that use it. Florida is the only state in the country where really anybody still uses the straight line method.
Right.
It is very inefficient. It is very costly. On average, it costs a lot more to fund your reserves in a straight line methodology than if you were to pool the reserves together. So if you're out there in a building that still has straight line, very, very strongly recommend you look into the pooled method. It's a much more efficient distribution of the cash that you have. Money is not locked up in these various accounts and restricted for use for other things. You want to have all that money in one spot as much as you can. It's going to be much more advantageous for you.
Great. Well, thank you, Will. You've again given phenomenal information for associations out there. And one of the things in closing, and I'll let you just give a few closing remarks, but from my end, I want to just make sure associations really keep on this deadline. It is so important to get that budget approved. When we've had a lot of associations that I've seen over the years, go into January, February, even March. Don't do that. I mean, you really need to get that done this year. Also, not only for the fact of the SIRS requirements, but just so that you can get planning for future years, particularly when you're going to have to now start funding these SIRS components as well as your regular reserves. So please work with your management company, or if you're self-managed, work with your finance committee, budget committee, to get these budgets out to the membership. And also, one of the other things that I just want to bring up is keep your membership aware of the process and all of these requirements that are now going to be foisted on them by all of these laws. Because one of the things that we hear all the time, and we have, I was talking to someone we know that's a board president who, says, I get all these rumors all the time. Oh, I heard there's going to be a $50,000 assessment next month for this. Again, a lot of misinformation is out there, and we just would say to all associations, keep your membership informed with the process as you go through the SIRS in terms of, showing them SIRS items, showing them the reserve studies, and working with them so that they know the right information and don't get wrong and rumors to be spread about, because obviously finance is one of the most important parts of managing an association, and you don't want to get that misconstrued or misinterpreted. Will, any closing comments from your side?
Yeah, I'll echo that. There's a lot of panic. There's a lot of anxiety out there. We get calls every week from people saying our owners are not going to be able to afford to live here anymore, thanks to all these requirements, and they're just, you can see the blood pressure rising. What I would tell everybody, first of all, like I tried to articulate earlier, the cost of living in a condo has always included paying for things like roofs and painting in one form or another. Over the years, unfortunately, a lot of people have done that through special assessments or through loans. And the state is basically just saying, you can't just count on that anymore. It's unfair. Everybody should pay their fair share of living in a building. So whereas you might have had, a special assessment for, $10,000 to pay for something that was otherwise very predictable, nowadays, you're going to be funding that through the annual budget. And hopefully the benefit is that when you do that, there will be no special assessment. So it's going to be a bumpy ride, I would think, as people adjust to this and the market kind of absorbs this new reality. But yeah, I believe that, our company and a lot of other companies are doing a good job. Management companies like AKAM are doing a good job to try to inform people and get the word out there and just calm the tension a little bit. And yeah, I hope this session was helpful for people in that way. I just, thank you guys again for the opportunity, and hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening.